All right, what's going on, everyone? Thanks for tuning back in. My name is Zach Davis. Special guest with me today, Dr. Don K. Preston. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Appreciate you having me on.
Do you watch my YouTube channel?
Occasionally I do.
Well, I just feel like if you would watch it more, you would probably learn a lot. So I just,
I,
I
I
just think
probably
there's.
would. I'm sure that's true.
All right, I just wanted to get that out of the way early and let you know. Whenever you want to debate something, just tell me because I'm not scared of you. So
Okay.
I
Okay.
just want to get that out of the way right off the bat.
Okay. Very good. I'll put you down for one of my upcoming debates.
All right. Maybe we can debate whether or not Arkansas is going to make a bowl game. So,
Oh no. that's for I'm unfortunately I'm convinced that is not going to happen.
now I've invited Mr. Preston on today. We're going to talk about the body of Second Corinthians chapters 3 to 5, and really it really extends on to chapter 6 and 7. But we're going to try to condense this to maybe a 3-part series, and we're going to talk about really just everything that's in Second Corinthians chapter 3 all the way to 5. When I think about this text, I see the explanation of First Corinthians chapter 15. And do you think that's a fair assertion that whatever's in First Corinthians 15, Paul is delving out here in this section of Scripture?
I absolutely agree with that. And back in my struggles with my own personal traditional eschatology, when I really dug deep into Second Corinthians chapter 3, and like you, I believe it extends all the way into chapter 7, at least verse 1, as he summarizes the previous 3 chapters. But nonetheless, it blew me away. Number one, how ignorant I'd been, and I still feel that very commonly today. But nonetheless, I had absolutely utterly failed to see that Ezekiel 37, as well as Ezekiel 16, by the way, uh, serves as the background. Paul is giving what the scholars called, what the Hebrews called, a midrash on Ezekiel 37 in Second Corinthians 3 through 6, especially. It's his commentary on Ezekiel. And unless we understand that Ezekiel really is the source of what Paul is doing, we're almost guaranteed not to understand Second Corinthians 3 and following.
All right. So, where's the very first place we need to start when we're thinking about this text?
I think we have to start, as just intimated, Ezekiel chapter 37 and the vision of the dry bones and the prophecy that is messianic through and through. Even the rabbis understood that. They proclaimed Ezekiel 37. And by the way, just to interject a thought here, uh, John Levinson, in his book Resurrection in Israel, that's not the precise name of it, but nonetheless, he points out that originally, and he's very emphatic on this, originally, Ezekiel 37 and the doctrine of the resurrection is taught there was taken and interpreted as a corporate resurrection of Israel. Israel was viewed as dead in captivity, dead in sin, alienated from God because of violation of Torah. But God was promising now here in Ezekiel 37 to bring both houses of Israel back together as corporate entities and restore them to a fellowship with God. But then he adds this, and this again, this is John Levinson in his book on resurrection, the resurrection of Israel. He says, but it got changed at a later period of time to speak of individual resurrection. And the question I've been asking is, and the question that I posed as I read the rest of his book is, who changed it and upon what authority?
Right.
And that's the problem. He doesn't explain who changed it, why it was changed. And I do know that some later rabbis, especially in the Tannaitic period, which is the first and second century Babylonian Talmud writings, they took a physical bodily resurrection view of Ezekiel 37, but they don't explain why they changed it.
Right.
It's just there. And to
Well,
me, that's unsatisfactory.
I think the hang up for a lot of people when you start talking about this stuff is how are you saying the resurrection happened in the past? Because obviously our general paradigm is not how it was. And I think, and that's why I asked you about this text. And, we'll get into chapters 4 and 5 in the next video, but we'll get into 3 today. I think this is a really, really important section. And whatever you do with this section, you have to do with 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And you take it back to Ezekiel 37, exactly like you explained. So you think we can...
Yeah, let me interject this. Most scholars understand that Paul, although he does not quote Ezekiel 37 verbatim, he is nonetheless echoing Ezekiel 37 all throughout 1 Corinthians 15. So there's a scholarly consensus on that. We're not inventing this as full preterists. We're just honoring what scholars acknowledge.
Does metalepsis apply whenever it's just allusion?
I really believe it does. I honestly think it does. I don't see any reason to exclude metalepsis. As far as I can determine, none of the leading scholars of the day who understand and who talk about metalepsis, none of them ever suggest, well, this is only a rough allusion to a given Old Testament text, therefore metalepsis does not come into play. And for pardon me, for those who may not be fully aware of what metalepsis is, this is a hermeneutic applied, practiced by not only the first century church, but the Hebraic writers as well. And here's what it means. When a writer or a speaker quoted just a small snippet from a prophetic text, they were bringing that entire context over to the mind of their readers or their hearers. So when Paul, for instance, in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, uses about 5, maybe 6, depending on how you look at it, different motifs and themes directly out of Ezekiel 37, even though he doesn't quote verbatim from Ezekiel 37, it comes real close, but he doesn't quote verbatim to a Hebrew of the first century, Christian, non-Christian Hebrew. They would have understood. Paul's talking Ezekiel 37.
Yeah. Well,
and this is such a fascinating area, Zach, as I'm sure you're aware. So many people today, they accuse us of cherry picking as preterists. And yet what do? They'll go to the Old Testament, they'll lift a single verse out of an entire chapter, and they'll run with it as if it's unrelated to the context of that Old Testament text. I run into this on a daily basis. And it's just like, wait a minute, this is not the way they did things. This is not the hermeneutic of the ancient Hebrews.
Well, that's the problem I run into when discussing Isaiah 25 or Hosea 13 in 1 Corinthians 15. I mean, whereas I'm looking for physical death in those texts, and I go back to Isaiah 25 and all in Hosea 13, and it's not to be found. So that was a major paradigm shift for me in using that idea. So
this is to me part of, there are many keys to understanding 1 Corinthians chapter 15. But in my recent debate with Chris Date, I had asked him prior to our debate, is the death and the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 the same identical death to be overcome through resurrection in Hosea chapter 13? And he wrote back and said, yes, absolutely is. And of course, when I read his answer prior to the debate, I'm going, thank you very much. So I had some charts prepared, and the chart is this. The death and the resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15, is the same death and resurrection prophesied by Hosea 13. But the death and the resurrection of Hosea chapter 13 was spiritual death. There's no biological death to be found in the text. The resurrection was to be from that spiritual death, alienation from God, separation from the land, etc. Therefore, the resurrection of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is overcoming spiritual death. And he had not a word of response to that.
He didn't want to touch it. He knew he couldn't.
No, he could not touch that. He had no answer for it. And as a matter of fact, I don't know if you're aware of it. I think you did. I think you were. After the debate was over, that very night, he produced another video apologizing to his followers for not being prepared for that debate.
I saw a Facebook post where he said that, and but I don't know. I don't even know if that's genuine though for not being prepared. I mean, because if he's given up that in Hosea 13, then I mean, there's a difference in not being prepared and knowing what the outcome is going to be as soon as you go down that road and not wanting to go down it. So,
Well, that's true, and I I don't know. All I know is what he said after the debate. So here we have Ezekiel 37, and for brevity's sake, we need to note that several constituent elements, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. Number one, the Lord speaks of Israel in captivity as a synagogue. That in the Septuagint, that's the word that he used. The synagogue in the Old Testament is an extremely, extremely important word. And then you take the compound word episynagogue, is used to describe the end times regathering from bondage, from death, being brought back into the presence of God. So here is Ezekiel being given this vision of Israel in bondage. They are a synagogue. But guess what? They're not all in one place. We normally think of a synagogue as a one single gathering.
right.
That's not the way it is in
Yeah.
Ezekiel. You go ahead.
Well, I've had people come back at me and say, well, this gathering of Ezekiel 37 took place at a prior time other than the New Testament. And you've got some major issues with that. Number one, in terms of exactly how did that happen, and then secondly, if it did happen, when were they scattered again, and then where's the prophecy of another regathering that takes place, and then secondly, why is Paul quoting it and alluding to it so much if that's the gathering? And I read Matthew 23:37 when he says he desired to gather them, and this is the same idea of I think the kind of gathering you're speaking of. So
Oh, it's absolutely the same kind of gathering. It's a covenantal fellowship gathering. And when people try to say, well, oh yeah, but Ezekiel 37 was probably fulfilled when they came back from Babylonian captivity. Um, Obviously, that cannot be right. And some of the things that you mentioned, there are many of the reasons why it cannot be true. But most of all, consider this. This regathering would take place when God poured out his spirit on the nation of Israel.
right.
Well, that can't be any time from Ezekiel until Acts chapter 2. God never poured out his spirit on Israel from Ezekiel until Acts chapter 2. And by the way, we have the testimony of the Maccabees in the books of Maccabees. They understood the spirit was absent from Israel from the time of Malachi onward. They understood there was no true prophet in Israel during even their own time, which is a fascinating study all by itself. Pardon me. They understood they didn't have the Holy Spirit guiding them as it was in the days of the true prophets. So when you've got the period of the Maccabees acknowledging they didn't have the Holy Spirit, and then you come to the New Testament and you find the Holy Spirit being poured out. And who was present on the day of Pentecost? Oh, there were Jews, devout men,
Right.
out of every nation under heaven. This is the diaspora that's there.
Yeah.
Now
Yeah.
you've got all 12 tribes, and that goes back to the significance of Ezekiel 37. While there was just really honestly just a pittance of people returned, some scholars calculate about somewhere between 42,000, 50,000 that returned under Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay, that was a remnant that returned. And they did offer 12 sacrifices on behalf of all 12 tribes. That's true. The Holy Spirit was not poured out in those days.
Yeah.
Just doesn't work.
Right. I would add also, even in Ezekiel, you get how there were two sticks that would be reunited back together. Well, you get this allegorical story in Acts 28 where Paul is gathering the sticks back together. And you, just the whole idea is it points you straight back to Ezekiel. And that's exactly what was going on. So I just don't see any way that this regathering / resurrection of Ezekiel 37 is not what we're seeing during the time of the New Testament. So,
yeah. And you've already touched on this, or at least intimated it. And that is, a lot of people today want to say, well, look at 1948. This is the regathering of Israel. Well, they had to be regathered under the new covenant with David as their king. I don't think that had anything to do with Israel in 1948.
No, you've written that out of context.
Guess what? The majority of people who returned to Israel in 1948 were, by their own admission, okay, I didn't invent this, by their own admission, they were atheists, agnostics, and unbelievers. 85% of those who went back to Israel in 1948. Well, that doesn't work at all for Ezekiel's prophecy. So we have here the promise of the resurrection of Israel. And the Lord says, verse 14, I will put my spirit in you and you shall live. I will place you in your own land. Then you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken and performed it, says the Lord. Well, to expand from 2 Corinthians chapter 3 all the way into chapter 5 now, 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 5, as Paul talks about the resurrection in verses 1 and following, he says, the one who has worked us or created us for this very thing is the Lord, who has also given us the earnest of the Spirit. Now, you're not going to be a good, faithful Jew in the first century conversant with Ezekiel and not understand that Paul is saying the Spirit had already been given. Well, if the Spirit had already been given, what was the Spirit supposed to do?
Right.
Raise Israel from the dead.
Yeah.
That's kind of tough to me.
I don't know how you get around it. And it's a paradigm shift. I mean, it is such a paradigm shift for somebody like me to come to it and recognize it and see it, and then ask the question, am I going to let Paul's use of the Old Testament dictate the way that I think about these things? Or am I going to pick and choose it? Or can I walk through the context of both of them and be consistent?
You know, Zach, being raised in the churches of Christ like I was, and hopefully we've got some members of the churches of Christ, the amillennialists particularly, not just churches of Christ, but in the amillennial camp, one of the most fundamental doctrines in that eschatological view is point number one, God was through with Israel at the cross or Pentecost maybe, or God most assuredly was through with the Old Testament at the cross, because they appeal to Colossians 2:16 and 17, where Paul ostensibly says that Christ took the law out of the way, nailing it to the cross. Well, it's not what it teaches at all. Paul wasn't talking about the law being nailed to the cross. I won't go into that. So these two fundamental doctrines go hand in hand, hand in glove. To me, it was such an earth-shattering paradigm shift. I mean, it rattled my cage when I discovered Paul and all of the New Testament writers in their eschatology were preaching and proclaiming and anticipating nothing but the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. And I'll never forget the day I saw this. Zach, it was funny. I was getting ready to engage in a formal public debate on preterism in Marlow, Oklahoma. But in preparation for it, I was sitting at my desk one day and I'm reading Paul, Acts chapter 24, 13 and following. This I confess to you that after the way that they call a sect, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets, that there is about to be resurrection of the just and the unjust. And, we sometimes talk about a passage of scripture jumping up and hitting us beside the head like a 2x4. No, this is more like a Mack truck, just roaring through my office, running all over the top of me, because it hit me like this. Wait a minute, Don. If God was through with Israel in the Old Covenant at the law, or at the cross, how could Paul say that his eschatology, his anticipation of the resurrection, was from Moses, the law, and the prophets? There's something wrong here. And there's the thing that's wrong is not Paul.
Right.
It's my view of Paul.
Yeah.
I mean, that just shook me. And to illustrate how powerful this was, so I had some charts made on this. Immediately before we began the debate, on the very first night of the debate, I asked my opponent. I walked over to him and headed into some questions. Very first question on the list. Are your eschatological hopes based upon taken from God's old covenant promises made to old covenant Israel, yes or no? Well, guess what? He was supposed to return them to me before the very first speech, right? But we're getting like within a minute or two, and he hadn't returned them. William Bell was my moderator. And you know William Bell and how imposing he can be. He walked over the table and he said, guys, you're supposed to give us the questions back with your answers. Oh, oh, I don't know what we did with those. And William says, find them. It was pure delay tactic is all it was. Finally, yeah, here they are. So I brought it back over to me. And that's the very first question I looked at. Out beside it, their answer was in great big bold letters, no, underlined 3 times, in quotation marks, with 3 exclamation points out beside it. And I go, okay, debate's over. So I got up there and I told the audience, I said, ladies and gentlemen, here's the crux of the issue. I asked my opponent if his eschatological hopes are based on God's old covenant promises made to old covenant Israel. I said, as a member of the Churches of Christ, I knew exactly how he was going to answer that. And he answered it that way. I read his answer, and then I put up a couple of charts, one after another. Peter said his eschatological hope was from Moses, Samuel, and all the prophets who had ever spoke of those first century days, first century times, and they were expecting the second coming of Christ and the restoration of all things. 2 Peter chapter 3, Revelation. I mean, just right down the line. I probably overdid it, but I really wanted, if anything, I wanted to drive that home so powerfully.
You didn't overdo it, surely.
Surely not. And he sat there. I mean, he sat there with ashen face. I mean, just trying to be emotionless. So we had a total of 5 debates planned. The very next day, during that debate, he completely ignored what I said. Not a word. At the next debate, he completely ignored it until the very last speech, which he had the very last speech. So I didn't get an opportunity to drive it home. And what he said was, well, now concerning Israel and the old law and eschatology, it may be true that we in the Churches of Christ need to do some more study on this, but that doesn't mean Don Preston's not a heretic and a false teacher. That's all he said. And after that, he canceled the other 2 debates. But this is how devastating this is for the amillennial and the really, to a certain extent, the postmillennial view, because they teach, even dispensationalists say the law of Moses was removed either at the cross. Some of them go so far as to say AD 70, but nonetheless, they say the law of Moses was removed. But then what do?
They're still looking for future promises.
They're looking for future promises, which means, guess what? The old law has not been done away with.
Right.
This is how important this is, folks. So when Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 through 6 is drawing directly on Ezekiel, which is a fundamental resurrection prophecy, when Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is drawing directly on Ezekiel 37, as well as Daniel chapter 12, Isaiah 25, on and on. How do we expect to properly interpret Paul's doctrine of the resurrection by ignoring his source for his teaching on the resurrection? It's just not a workable hermeneutic at all. And yet it's the hermeneutic that I operated on for years as a young minister, as someone growing up in the Churches of Christ. It's what I heard constantly.
I'm amazed still to see even people who I would maybe even former friends who are, considered fairly knowledgeable in the Bible, and how they take these New Testament texts and they never go back. They never go back and put it in where it's being quoted from, and how those things have to fit together. And that's why I tell people all the time that the Bible is the best interpreter of itself, because whatever's going on in the Old Testament can't contradict the fulfillment. Now, it can be an illusion or whatever. It can be but it cannot contradict the context as to what's going on and how they're being used. It just
Yeah,
can't.
and that's the critical element about it. And let's face it. Let's go right here to Ezekiel chapter 37. The Lord said in verse 14, "I'm going to raise you up out of your graves, and I'll put you in your land." Well, our good dispensational friends, what do they say? Look, Preston, it says land.
Yeah.
Land means land.
Right.
And yet, throughout the New Testament, what do the New Testament writers tell us? They say that the dwelling place is now Christ.
Yeah.
There's not a passage in the New Testament that indicates that they were looking for any kind of a restoration to the land. As a matter of fact, they tell us, Hebrews chapter 11, 13 to 16, that Abraham, to whom the promise of the land was originally given,
Yeah.
if he would have been mindful of the land, he could have stayed in the land.
Yeah.
He could have had that physical land, but he looked to a heavenly city and a heavenly country.
Well, and
Spiritual.
how come when Paul went on his missionary excursions that he never told them to move back to Jerusalem? And I mean, that was never the goal. And they're selling the land in Acts 3 and 4. So,
And to me, and I've said this on many programs, to me, one of the most powerful texts on this very concept is Hebrews chapter 12, verse 21 and following. Now, in Hebrews chapter 12, the writer says, "You have not come to Mount Sinai. You have not come to the mountain that could be touched. And if so much as an animal touches that mountain, it's to be thrust through with the spear. You have come to Mount Zion." Now, folks, as I am sometimes want to say, you got to catch the power of this. And what I mean by that is this: when you look at the prophetic scriptures in all the major and minor prophets as well, the eschatological hope of Israel was Zion. Every tenet of salvation, doesn't matter what it is the kingdom, it is salvation, it is redemption, it is restoration. Every single tenet of eschatology that you can name in the Old Testament, it is posited in Zion when the Lord would redeem Zion. Well, where's Zion? It's in the land. Obviously, it's the capital of the land. So when the Old Testament prophets spoke with great anticipation about the coming redemption of Zion, and it's fascinating that in Isaiah 62, which is a passage that Jesus and the New Testament writers either quote or allude to over and over, it is a prophecy of the redemption of Zion. "I will not keep my peace until Zion is restored," until the Lord blesses Zion. Okay. And in that text, by the way, he says the Lord will restore, and he uses in the Septuagint, he uses the word diorthosis. And diorthosis is the word used in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 10, telling us that the law, the Old Covenant law, and the temple and the cultus was imposed until the time of Reformation, diorthosis. Diorthosis is another one of those really key words found in the Old Testament. It's kind of like episunagoge. It is another Greek word is apokatastasis, which means restoration. Apokatastasis and diorthosis are direct synonyms. They both mean to put things back in their proper order. So my point is, here is Isaiah 62 talking about the redemption of Zion. By the way, at the time of the remarriage between Yahweh and Israel. "As a young man rejoices over his bride, so shall I rejoice over you. You shall no longer be called forsaken, but you shall be called Hephzibah and Beulah." Zach, I used to sing that song. "Oh, Beulah land, sweet Beulah land," blah, blah. Had no clue what I was singing.
you didn't know you were already in it, did you?
I didn't realize it, didn't I? Was just like, but I love the song, boy. Great tune, et cetera, et cetera. And
let me give an overview for anybody that's watching, kind of where you're headed with this. So, you correct me now because I'm just trying to think through. So, essentially, they've broken the covenant. They've been scattered. all the promises say that they would be regathered, but not physically. They would be gathered spiritually back into the land, say it another way, to be gathered back into Christ through faith when the Spirit would be poured out. Paul is now taking those promises, saying that's happening during the first century and predicting the fullness of that resurrection quickly per Acts chapter 24. Is all of that fair?
Absolutely fair.
So, and now we're going to move into the idea of corporate Israel, that Israel, the north and the south, that Judah are going to be gathered back together with the Gentiles coming in on the promises. Is that fair as well? Okay. They're going to come in and have equal status, and they're going to be raised in new covenant glory corporately. So
Right.
when you're going to read some of these passages that we're about to get into in 2 Corinthians 3-5, when Mr. Don's seeing body here, he's not seeing individual physical bodies. He's reading this as a corporate collective group in many places in reference to the old covenant promises of Israel. And since Paul is quoting from Ezekiel or alluding to places like Ezekiel 37, and that's what he's building off of, then if those are the promises in Ezekiel 37, that's the fulfillment of what the Apostle Paul has to be showing. Is all that fair or no? Because that's just me thinking.
Absolutely. In other words, I will use a word that the dispensationalists use as a pejorative term, spiritualizing. Not allegorizing, but spiritualizing. They take those promises that the Jews, even the Essene community, took in a literal, physical, materialistic manner and expected a literal, physical restoration of Jerusalem, the temple, the priesthood, the sacrifices, all purged and purified. They took those literally. Jesus and his apostles spiritualized every one of those promises. And by the way, I'm not leaving Hebrews chapter 12 just yet. bear with me. So when here is Isaiah chapter 62 foretelling the restoration of Israel at the coming of the Lord with his salvation to reward his servants, Isaiah 62:10-12. And then in the last two verses of it, he reiterates the promise, you shall no longer be called a city forsaken, but you shall be called the redeemed of the Lord. Wait a minute. He's talking about the city, Zion, and he says, you shall be called the redeemed of the Lord. Well, people are redeemed, not a city. So now he's identifying really Zion as people. So here in Hebrews chapter 12, and remember, folks, let me reiterate this point. Every soteriological, that is to say, salvation tenet, every eschatological, that is to say, every last days element that the Old Testament associates with Zion, that is where all of these things would come. Isaiah 46:13, I will place salvation in Zion. So when the Hebrews writer pops up and says, you have come to Mount Zion, I'm real sure that he wasn't writing to a couple of 100,000 people gathered around literal physical Zion in Jerusalem.
Right.
No. Matter of fact, he says, and some translations render it this way, beautiful, beautiful picture. You are gathered in a festal assembly. I'm seeing Sukkot. I'm seeing the Feast of Harvest. They are standing there awaiting the consummation of the feast days calendar, the ultimate resurrection, the time of salvation of Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 28. I don't know how anything could be any more powerful. And it goes back to Matthew chapter 23, a passage you alluded to a few moments ago. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that kills the prophets and slays those who sin unto you, how often I would have gathered you. Well, to go back to what I said earlier, this is the Greek word episynagoge. This is found in Psalms 102. It's found in Isaiah 27:12. It's found in passage after passage after passage from the Old Testament about the eschatological gathering to Messiah at the end of the age at the harvest. That's what this is all about. But you made a really powerful point there that when Paul went throughout the Roman Empire, he didn't say, hey, everybody, meet me in Jerusalem. No, gather your stuff together. Let's all take a trip back to Jerusalem. No, nor do we find Jesus ever, not one time, did Jesus ever say, okay, now look, I want everybody who's one of my followers on the following date to meet me in Jerusalem. No, I wanted to gather you, episynagoge. And he said, by the way, that he would gather them in spite of the rejection of Israel. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 31, at the time of his coming in judgment of Jerusalem, the Son of Man will send forth his angels. They shall gather together, episynagoge, the elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to another. Folks, this is all about covenantal gathering, spiritual fellowship gathering. Has nothing whatsoever to do with where you're at geographically. I mean, you can be in Ardmore, Oklahoma, for crying out loud, and be gathered to Christ.
All right, let me ask you this, just for people watching this. I'm trying to just think along the lines of where people would go. Why does the gathering happen in 80 70? Why is the climax pointing you there? Because I think my answer would be because that's when the law was fulfilled. And the fulfillment of the law brings about the full reversal of the death that we see placed at the beginning.
I think that's one aspect of it without any doubt whatsoever. The second aspect of it has to do with the time of the harvest of the old covenant age. You see, the old covenant age had to fully end before the new covenant age could be fully set in place. This is Matthew chapter 13. The Son of Man will send forth his angels. They shall gather together the wheat, cast the tares into the fire. And people say, well, that's the harvest at the end of the world. Well, yes, but it's the end of the old covenant cosmos. It's not the end of time, and it's not the end of the endless Christian age. But it was the old covenant system that had to be harvested. And what was going to happen at the harvest? You touched on it briefly a few moments ago, and that is God was gathering together the righteous remnant out of Israel, bring them together with Gentiles, and create this new man that Paul refers to in Ephesians chapter 2 as he's writing to Gentiles. And he says, you at one time were alienated or through wicked works in your minds. That's Colossians 1:21, excuse me. But nonetheless, he says, at that time you were without God, strangers from the covenant of promise, having no hope, without God in this world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were afar off are made nigh through the blood of Christ. He is our peace. He has made both, that's Gentile, Jew, one new man. This goes all the way back to the Old Testament of God promising to create a new people. This is one aspect that I didn't pay attention to for several years. But then you go to Psalms chapter 22, and he says, a generation that were yet to be born, and God's going to create a new people. Psalms 102, at the time of the destruction of heaven and earth, the Lord says, a people that is yet to be born will dwell in this new creation. Isaiah 65, the Lord God will slay you, speaking to Old Covenant Israel, and call his people by a new name. So you have all of these texts, and there are others, by the way. Isaiah 43 and Isaiah 49 are really, really interesting. Isaiah 49, in speaking of the day of salvation, the restoration of the land, by the way, Isaiah 49:8. But in Isaiah 49, the Lord says that at that time, you will say, who are these children who are born to me besides the ones that I had? Because God was going to create a new people. Powerful stuff. And it's not physical descendancy, just like Paul said, those who are of Israel are not all Israel. They are not Israel. Just because they might be able to claim descendancy from Abraham didn't make them Israel in Paul's eyes. You're all the children of God by faith.
Yeah. All right. Let's emphasize this too. in the old covenant, God's glory dwells in the temple. Okay. Well, this is the shifting that's happening. So as Christ is the light, this is God's glory now dwells in the new covenant temple, and it's a spiritual temple. So by faith, they're back in the presence of God. That's why the land was so important under the old covenant, because that's where God's presence was, and that's where the people gathered with him. But now it's a spiritual gathering through faith in Christ, and that's not a physical location. Is all that fair to say too?
That's absolutely spot on, as far as I'm concerned. I won't debate you on that.
All right, that's fine. All right, I'm going to force you to get a little bit right now, just to kind of start 2 Corinthians 3. We're
Okay.
going to barely bump into it just a little here. We got about 20 minutes left.
Yeah, I
So,
know.
however, that's okay. We had to lay some Ezekiel groundwork and maybe answered some questions that people might appreciate just a little. So, I'm going to read a little. You stop me when you want to, and if you don't stop me, then I'll make some suggestions, and then I call this the Vern Gosden passage of scripture. Do you know who Vern Gosden is?
No, I'm sorry, I don't.
You got to get up to date on your country music. Okay. He wrote a
Oh,
song.
okay.
He wrote a song called Chiseled in Stone a long time ago. So here we go.
Okay.
Do we begin again to commend ourselves, or do we need, as some others, epistles of commendation to you, or letters of commendation from you? You are our epistle, written in our hearts, known and read by all men. Clearly, you are an epistle of Christ, ministered by us, written not with ink, but by the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of flesh, that is, of the heart. So when I read this, right away I've got a clear old covenant, new covenant contrast. Is that what you see? The
Absolutely.
ink and stones versus new
Yep.
covenant spirit written on the heart.
Heart versus flesh, actually.
So when you read heart versus flesh, and this is something that I've dealt with a lot, Mr. Don, is the idea of flesh in reference to the old covenant system. Like when I read Romans chapter 7 and Paul is telling them, he says, you were formerly of the flesh in Romans 7 and 8. And I'm reading that saying, what does he mean when they're formerly in the flesh? They've still got a physical body on.
You are not in the flesh.
Yeah. That's a hard shift. I think that I had to go through, and I actually went through it in Hebrews, because in Hebrews chapter 2, you get that idea of flesh and blood, and you start to see all these flesh and blood. And even back to your Hebrews chapter 12 point, it says, in 1 Corinthians 15 that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom. Okay. But in Hebrews chapter 12, they were already inheriting the kingdom. They were receiving a kingdom in process of it, and they were still in physical flesh. So just basic things for you guys. Listen to this. The association of heart in the new covenant and spirit and flesh to the old covenant, I think, is something that's pretty important.
Let's throw another passage here that permeates Paul's thought throughout all of his epistles almost. Paul was writing to the Galatians, probably around 49 AD, very, very early. It's his first epistle, most people believe. And yet here are the Galatians that have very quickly begun apostatizing. They're going back into Judaism. And so Paul challenges them, and he says, "Oh, foolish Galatians, who have bewitched you that you should not obey the truth? Have you begun in the spirit, that you are now made perfect in the flesh?"
Yeah.
Look, folks, if we approach this, I was reading on Facebook just the other day, this one individual, he was castigating me. Imagine that. I was for certain doomed to go to hell and leading others with me. And he said, flesh means exactly that. It doesn't mean anything other than that. So when I pointed out some of these texts that you brought up and that I'm bringing up here, all of a sudden he decided to abandon that discussion. When Paul says, back to Romans chapter 8, if Christ is in you, the body is dead. Well, that means that only if Jesus is in me will I die physically. But Paul says you are not in the flesh, but in the spirit. He's not writing to Casper ghost people, disembodied people. And I've used Romans chapter 8 many, many times, by the way, which has a direct bearing on 1 Corinthians 15, as you know. Okay, wait a minute. Paul's saying you're not in the flesh, but in the spirit. Paul says flesh and blood should not inherit the kingdom. People want to look at that language of flesh and blood there and say, oh, well, this can't go to heaven. Well, that's a good thought, and I'm pretty sure this will not go to heaven, this biological flesh, but That's not what Paul's talking about. Paul's talking about a way of life, which is the way of flesh. And so when we come to these passages, commentator after commentator down through the years has taken note of the fact when Paul uses the terms flesh and spirit, he is not that Greek word that he uses, sarx, S-A-R-X, is the way that we would spell that. He's not using that in the way that we as Westerners would normally use the word flesh. Some people have even called Paul a Gnostic, a pre-Gnostic, or something like that. Because, I mean, after all, if he says, you're not in the flesh, but you're in the spirit, boy, that sounds Gnostic. Whoa. But it's not. That is Paul's view of two manners of living. You walk after the Spirit, which is to walk in harmony with the Holy Spirit through the Word, or you live according to your own selfish physical desires, or in the case of Galatians, you walk after the old covenant system. Both of those are to walk in the flesh.
Let me ask you this, just point of clarification for me personally. Do all preterists in this full preterist camp, do they not believe the kingdom came in AD 70? Would all preterists say that or no?
That's a really good question, Zach. I don't know that I could answer that definitively. You know, sometimes I read comments by some people who claim to be full preterists, and I literally recoil going, boy, that's not what I believe. And I thought I had a pretty good handle on what preterists believe. I'm, you know.
The reason I ask it is because if we're saying that flesh and blood can't inherit the kingdom, and we believe that the kingdom came and we've inherited the kingdom and the kingdom is here now, that's a problem.
Yes, it is.
I don't know.
And I'll tell you this, a real quick anecdote. Years and years and years ago, when I lived at Shawnee, Oklahoma, ministered there for 11 years, fantastic congregation. I went across that term, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of heaven. And one of the men, very, very studious guy, and mind you, I was not a preterist at the time. I was studying, I was struggling with my eschatology, but I was certainly not a preterist. But I made the comment, flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. He came up to me after services. He was always a very, very humble, very respectful guy. He said, Don, let me ask you a question. He said, are you a member of God's kingdom, Christ's kingdom today? And I said, of course. He said, aren't you in flesh and blood? Well,
recalculating.
Oh, his name was Maurice. And I said, that's a really good point. Because, you know, I've been preaching for years, Colossians chapter 1, where Paul writes to the Colossae brethren, and he says, you've been translated out of the power of darkness, which means you've been taken out of death, because the word darkness in the Hebraic thought meant death. You've been translated out of the kingdom of power of darkness into the kingdom of God's dear Son. Okay, they're in the kingdom. Now, was it consummated? No, but they're in the kingdom.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's, I understand the question there. And sometimes I hear and read preterists say things that makes me go, I don't think you've thought this through real well.
Yeah. All right, let's get through, let's see if we can get through verse 6 here. And we have such trust through Christ toward God, not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think of anything as being from ourselves. Our sufficiency is from God, who also made us sufficient as ministers of the new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. Now, here's where I really want to camp for a second. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. All right, when we were reading Old Covenant, New Covenant contrast, when I think New Covenant, I think life, eternal life. When I think Old Covenant, I think kills. If I asked you and said, in what regards does the Old Covenant kill? How can Paul say this and write this? And well, why is this important to his discussion of resurrection from the dead here?
Well, I think Romans chapter 7 contains the answer to that, where Paul said in Romans chapter 7, 6 and following, I was alive once without the law, but the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. You know, very quickly. I've been going round and round with some folks on Facebook over the last several days, and they deny the reality of spiritual death, and they do so based upon the fact that the term spiritual death never appears in the New Testament. I said, well, in the first place, you're guilty of a negative fallacy. You're saying, well, if a given specific term doesn't appear, then the doctrine does it. But I said, what kind of death did Paul die when he sinned? I'm pretty sure that he's not saying, I died physically, just keeled right over dead in a heart attack. Oh, by the way, but I'm still alive now. No.
Yeah.
He
That's an
died.
untenable position.
It is absolutely, completely, totally untenable. And that system, if I may use that term, of dying through sin, but being biologically alive, is found throughout the Pauline as well as the Petrine literature. When Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 5 is talking about the care of the widows and giving the qualifications of the widows and what have you, he talks about a young widows, and he says, you got to be careful doing this because they're liable to take that and engage in ungodly ways of living, and thus they will be dead while they're living. Well, you can't make that anything except, quote, spiritual death. They're not biologically dead. Anybody can see that. Anybody can know that. The same in Ephesians chapter 2, and you who were once dead in your sins and trespasses. They were dead. Colossians chapter 1, you who were once enemies and alienated from God through wicked works in your minds, yet now has he reconciled. And you go right straight to Colossians chapter 2 and verse 13, and it says, you who were once dead in your trespasses. So here we have the definition of death through sin. And it's not biological. You were alienated because of sin. You were dead in sin.
Right.
That just goes hand in hand.
I don't want to dwell here, but would you say in Revelation 20, when it says they came to life, that's the same idea of Ephesians 2?
I believe that's exactly what that deals with.
Right.
Yes.
I'll leave that there. Let's see. We can make another little headway here. Let's see what we can do. I want to get your thoughts in some of this text. Just kind of free flowing. We're not trying to go through it all, but I want to make sure we emphasize this idea of the death, because even a while ago when you're talking about the death and they kept on sinning, well, that's Hosea chapter 13 back to me completely. When they died and kept on sinning, you're getting into the same idea of stuff here. So anyway, if the ministry of death, old covenant, written and engraved on stones, was glorious, and I think this is important, you and I are not saying that the old covenant was bad. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, but it couldn't attain to what they needed. They needed a better covenant in Christ that could fulfill the promises. Okay.
Let me interject this.
We'll interject.
To verify what you're saying. Paul, back to the book of Galatians, says in chapter 5, 20 and 21, if a law could have been given that could give life, then verily righteousness, notice his interplay between righteousness and life.
Yeah.
For the Jew, righteousness was life.
Yeah.
Okay. But if a law could have been given that could have given life, then verily righteousness would have been through the law. So Paul was living, and he was a great example of this, how much he loved Torah. He says that in Romans chapter 7.
Yeah.
The law is good and it's spiritual and it's holy, but it could not bring life. All it could do was condemn.
I think this is another important part, like in Galatians 5:5, when they're eagerly awaiting righteousness. Well, that's Daniel 9:24 when he says that, hang on a second, I got something going on here.
We through the Spirit eagerly await the hope of righteousness.
Yeah, in Daniel 9:24, when he's talking about how in the 70 weeks that he would bring in, 70 weeks are determined to bring in everlasting righteousness. Okay, well, this hasn't happened yet. Back to our discussion of fulfilling the old covenant at the cross. This hasn't even happened yet when Galatians is written. Now, when you're talking about the need for the fullness of spiritual life, the fullness of this resurrection life, this gets us again back to 80-70. But the reason that we would apply that there is because this righteousness is given once the law is fulfilled. So, Don, let me ask this way. Is it fair for me to say that Daniel's 70 weeks, essentially, if righteousness is connected to the resurrection, is it fair to say that Daniel's 70 weeks were for the resurrection, for the purpose of fulfilling what is being brought in as the resurrection?
I found a book one time entitled 70 Weeks Are Determined for the Resurrection by some dude named Don K. Preston. I don't know anything about him, but anyway.
We're not putting a plug here.
No, we're not plugging anything. No, just pointing out. This was another one of those epiphany moments. I've had so many of those in my life and ministry, Zach. It's just, and it's always such a thrill. I have to tell you, just such a thrill to find these glaring, glowing nuggets and see how it sheds light on other passages and what have you. But let's expand from Galatians chapter 5. We have to see Daniel chapter 9 in a strictly covenantal context. Why was Daniel in Babylon? It is because Judah and Jerusalem had violated Torah. And he extols God's righteousness. It's Daniel 9, Daniel's prayer to Yahweh. It's called a Reb Todeh prayer. There are about 5 constituent elements to a Reb Todeh prayer. Number one, it is a prayer acknowledging God's righteousness. It is a confession of sin. It is a recognition of God's justice and judgment. It is a prayer for forgiveness. It's a confession of those sins. And then it is a prayer for blessing and what have you. But most of all, the point that I want to get at is Daniel says, to paraphrase him roughly, Lord, look, we sinned. We broke Torah. And you were righteous in bringing this judgment on us. So why was Judah and Jerusalem in Babylonian captivity? Judgment for violating Torah. Well, Jeremiah had promised that they would be restored. Daniel reads the prophecy. He knows the time is up. So he's wanting to know when they're going to be restored. And Daniel is told that the ultimate restoration, what he genuinely longs for, yes, he wants to go back to Jerusalem, no doubt. But what he really longs for is to be brought back into the true fellowship of God. That's what Daniel really honestly wants. And so he's told, okay, 70 weeks are determined, ... to bring in everlasting righteousness. Well, back to Paul in Galatians 5. They couldn't be righteous through the law.
Right.
The law could not bring them to righteousness. And so Daniel, in praying for that ultimate righteousness, is actually praying for a new covenant.
Right. It's the same as Abraham. When he's looking to the promises, they're looking in the same place as Abraham was per Hebrews 11.
They're looking beyond the physical land. They're looking beyond the physical realities. They're looking beyond the physical city. They're looking to the heavenly city and the heavenly country. And again, they're looking for the new covenant that could bring life and righteousness. So when we view Daniel chapter 9 through the prism of covenant transformation, then all of a sudden it sheds a totally new light.
That's right.
I dare say, for most interpreters, for the understanding of Daniel chapter 9. Because the new covenant was promised to Israel, so that Israel, receiving her salvation, could then offer salvation to the world. That's how God always intended things to be done.
Paul and the New Testament writers are fulfilling what the Old Testament prophets looked for, but we failed to understand the nature and timing of what the Old Covenant prophets were looking for.
Absolutely. Well stated. So here is Daniel in this great, wonderful, marvelous promise of the coming of everlasting righteousness. Peter picks up on that. According to his promise, as Peter talks about the coming day of the Lord,
right,
in which the elements in the earth and the elements that are therein shall be burned up. Nevertheless, according to his promise, we look for a new heaven and new earth wherein dwells righteousness. Right back to Isaiah 65 and 66 and the new heaven and the new earth. And of course, Daniel is building on Isaiah 65 and 66 himself as he promises this world of everlasting righteousness. Daniel's building on Isaiah 51, Isaiah 64 to 66. They're all interrelated with one another. So here is Peter as he anticipates this coming new heaven and new earth, and it's where righteousness dwells, just like Revelation chapter 21. Now, Revelation 21 doesn't use the terminology of everlasting righteousness of Daniel 9, but I don't know of a commentator really that disagrees with that.
Right.
They all agree with this. This is what Daniel was predicting. By the way, I would point this out. Richard Carrier, that I'll be debating on October the 12th, he understands that Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 was predicting the new heaven and new earth. He was predicting the resurrection. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. The question is, did that promise fail?
Yep.
Well, since Daniel was anticipating the transition from the old covenant that could not give life or righteousness to a new covenant that could give life and righteousness, then when the new covenant came, guess what? That's promise fulfilled. Unfortunately, Dr. Carrier believes that Peter was looking for a literal, physical, material creation, as the dispensationalists do, and as amillennialists and postmillennialists likewise do in our modern world.
So all that to say that we think the old covenant was glorious, clearly as Paul states, but it couldn't fulfill the promises that they looked for. So the children of Israel could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of the glory of his countenance, which glory was passing away. Now, this brings us back to the story where Moses goes up, meets with God, his face is shining, he wears the veil, but eventually his face stopped shining, but he still wore the veil, that it was covered in it. So this glory that Moses had was passing. Paul's now using it to tell us about the passing of the old covenant so that the old covenant, which was glorious, could give way to a more glorious covenant. All that fair?
Absolutely.
How will the ministry of the Spirit not be more glorious? So it's a superseding glory. And this reminds me of the Mount of Transfiguration. This is exactly where this takes my mind back to.
Yeah.
So you've got Moses and Elijah who are fading away. The Father says, quotes from Deuteronomy, "This is my son, hear him." New covenant in glory. When does the new covenant come in full glory? When the law and the prophets, Moses and Elijah, pass away. It's all pointing you to the same spot.
And let's not forget the transfiguration, according to Peter in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16 and following, was a vision of Christ's parousia. So you have covenant transformation being undeniably posited at the parousia. That's incredible stuff.
I haven't asked anybody in the last year. I'll ask people. I asked a guy the other day, and doesn't know anything about preterism. I said, "Is the old covenant still around?" And the answer is no. Every time, all these people, it's always no. It's always no, and that plays such a huge role, because the only way for things to be legitimate, according to the text, the old covenant should still be around if the parousia hadn't happened yet.
That's exactly right. And I believe it or not, I started writing a book on this some years ago. I've written on it in two of my books, particularly Like Father, Like Son on Clouds of Glory, because, and this is what's amazing. When I started doing research for that book, and unfortunately I've gotten sidetracked, I've written like 5 books since I started that one. But when I started doing the research, it blew me away to realize how many scholars down through the centuries have realized what the transfiguration was about, covenant transformation. Okay, so you'd think, okay, now that they've got that idea down pat, they ought to see the power of 2 Peter chapter 1, where Peter says, at the transfiguration, they saw a vision of Christ's parousia. Well, if the transfiguration is about covenant transformation, and it's a vision of the second coming of Christ, then how do you separate covenant transformation from the second coming of Christ?
Right.
And to get back to what you were saying, virtually everyone says and agrees, oh yeah, no, the old covenant's passed away. Thank you very much. Then the second coming has happened.
And another important note is during the time of Corinthians and Hebrews, it hadn't all passed away yet. That all the stuff was done at the cross stuff, even by some people in our camp, and that blows my mind. I don't.
Yeah, I had I had a written debate some years ago with a guy. He's a full preterist. I won't call his name. I'm not trying to embarrass him. He's a really good guy. But the point of it is, he just insisted the law passed at the cross. And it didn't matter that I pointed out in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, all of the present active indicatives that Paul uses. The covenant that is passing away. The old covenant glory that is passing away. The new covenant glory of we are being present active, transformed from glory to glory.
We'll get to that in the next week.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's true. But 2 Corinthians, now look, folks, what the reason we're saying that 2 Corinthians chapters 3 through 6 is based on Ezekiel is what's Paul talking about? 2 Corinthians chapter 3, new covenant. What does Ezekiel chapter 37 promise? Restoration of Israel under the Messiah, the lineage of David, and a covenant of peace. The new covenant. You know, Zach, I don't know how much you are aware of this. It was actually came as a shock to me some years ago to learn that diehard dispensationalists, there's a large chunk of dispensationalists that do not believe the promised new covenant of Jeremiah has ever been established. Pardon me. Blew me away.
And you don't mean in full sense, you mean it already? Or
no, it's not present at all.
Oh wow.
Thomas Ives says, while the promised Jeremiah covenant, and he links that with Ezekiel 37, while the Jeremiah covenant has not been established, we today are receiving the benefits of it. Yeah. Well, as far as I'm concerned, that's almost a little bit like saying, while we don't have $1 million in the bank, I'm receiving the benefits of it.
He's saying we're not in the new covenant anyway. I don't care how he works.
That's exactly what he's saying. We are not under the new covenant. I don't know how you can get the benefits of a covenant that does not yet exist.
Yeah.
At all. I mean, it just doesn't make any good sense. But that's part and parcel of the dispensational paradigm.
Yeah.
They just denied that the new covenant promised by Jeremiah, promised by Ezekiel, it simply has never been established. So what did Jesus do in Matthew chapter 27? This is my blood, as he took the cup, of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sin. What did Jeremiah promise? A new covenant wherein sins would be forgiven. Hello. But that's not what Jesus was establishing in Matthew 26.
That's the already not yet covenant.
Yeah, well, it's amazing.
We'll end this one here. We'll pick it back up. I think we made it to let me see where we made it to. We made it all the way there to verse 8. So
okay, that's good.
Pick back up. We'll work through 9, and then next time we'll discuss specifically the how they were being transformed, like you were talking about in the active sense, and we'll discuss some of what that means. So thank you, Mr. Don, for joining me. And
thank you for the invitation.
I'll post this one today, and then we'll get back on it, and however soon we can get together. So
sounds good. Thank you. Bye-bye.